welcome to Daily Debrief brought to you by People's Dispatch. I am Shriya. In today's episode, we take a look at the anti-government protests in Kenya. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia has decided to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And finally, FIFA has announced to remove Indonesia as host of this year's Under-20 Football World Cup. In Kenya, thousands of people took to the streets in Nairobi this week to protest the government of President William Ruto. The protests have been called for by the opposition leader Raila Odinga, who has tapped into public anger against rising costs of living. A young man was shot dead in Kisumu on Monday, the second death reported in the protest so far. The first was a 21-year-old university student who was killed after police fired live rounds in the city on March 20. We're joined by Tanupriya Singh from People's Dispatch, who has the latest on this story. Thanks for joining us today, Tanupriya. So, first off, can you tell us when did these protests begin and what are the demands of the people who are protesting?
Yeah, so as we're speaking today, Kenya is witnessing a fresh round of protests on that's March 30th, today on Thursday, and this is the third major demonstration that has happened in the country since the protests began last week on Monday. And thousands of people have continued to take to the streets, especially in parts of the capital of Nairobi and also in the city of Kisumu. And these protests have continued this week, especially despite a ban on demonstrations that was issued by the Kenyan police over the weekend. So clearly, even today there have been initial reports have come in of protesters burning tires, blocking roads. So there is a lot of mobilization despite sort of the ban on the part of the government. And the protests themselves have been called by the current leader of the opposition, Raila Odinga, who himself is a former prime minister. And the response of the state has been quite heavy-handed. We've seen deployments of police, anti-riot units, and police using tear gas, water cannons. There have also been reports of live rounds. At least 2 deaths have been reported so far. One was a university student who was killed in Kisumu last week. So there has been a very heavy-handed response. There have been reports of confrontations between protesters and police in certain parts. So the situation remains quite tense. And the reason behind the protest that Raila Odinga has called, the reasons that he's presented is one which is sort of very much in the public eye right now, is that of worsening high cost of living in Kenya. And the other is this long sort of challenge that Odinga has mounted against the 2022 presidential elections, which saw him lose to the incumbent president, who is William Ruto. So, you're seeing these mass mobilizations where Odinga has essentially tapped into this public anger against the government to now, once again, push for Ruto's resignation. So, where the situation remains quite tense, there's also fears of widespread violence, which has happened in Kenya before, especially around the context of elections. So, Odinga has called for protests every Monday and Thursday. So, conditions remain quite tense in the country.
Right, Tanupriya, and what are the larger issues that people in Kenya are facing? I mean, one, that the economy is not working so well, and the second, how the government repression has been working. Could you elaborate about that?
Yeah, definitely. So, as I said, Odinga has been able to tap into this public anger. So, conditions have worsened significantly for the Kenyan people in over the past year. Even inflation presently in February it soared to 9.2%, driven primarily by food costs. The country is also facing severe drought. Some nearly 6 million people expected to be food insecure by June. So, you have high food prices. The prices of electricity have gone up significantly. Fuel costs have gone up significantly. So, you have this situation. And on top of that, what has also driven public anger is that, when William Ruto was campaigning, he campaigned on this ostensibly very pro-poor rhetoric. He sort of drew this very, sort of became synonymous with him was this, he evoked this class war in Kenya of the hustlers, which is the poor minority, versus the dynasties, which are these, politically influential, wealthy elite. And he invoked that, and for a lot of people, for a lot of the youth of Kenya, his whole push towards, if you just hustle, you can sort of make something of yourself. He even drew from his own experience of rising up from the peasantry, and this whole idea of you can make it if you try, and this whole idea of free enterprise. So he really championed that. And but what happened is that despite campaigning on this sort of popular rhetoric, once he came to power, within days of assuming office, he slashed subsidies on maize, and he slashed subsidies on fuel. And now the government is talking about expanding the tax base, which in the absence of taxing the rich really just means that you're imposing more taxes on the poor. And all of this is happening under the dictates of the IMF and the World Bank, so it's not completely, an internal process. And now, just last week, I believe the government has sponsored this bill that was approved by cabinet called the privatization bill, which will essentially remove parliamentary oversight from the sale of state-owned entities. And among the entities that are sort of slated for privatization include public universities and banks. So you already have a country where there's a huge amount of inequality, there is worsening economic conditions, and then you have this sort of an attack on the public sector. So this all has been happening. There is other sort of IMF austerity policies in places, an ongoing wage freeze in the public sector. There's a hiring freeze in the public sector. So there is a lot of anger because of this disconnect between this president that was elected and then the kind of policies that he has pursued. And even in terms of for the story that especially on the left in Kenya, so particularly the Communist Party with whom I spoke with for this story. So these protests are breaking out, but they sort of you understand the public anger, but what the broader left forces are a little wary of is the co-optation of this public anger of the people, economic conditions by an opposition who is not really interested in serving these needs. So what the Communist Party also believes is that these this public anger must not be co-opted by an elite. And this has happened in Kenya before. When there is a political agreement, there is that 2018 handshake where, these parties come to their own sort of politically negotiated agreement, but the masses have nothing to take home from it. So this protests are certainly presenting an opportunity for the Kenyan left to offer a clear alternative for the people, and what they're pushing for is really an economic model and a development model that is geared towards benefiting the majority.
Thank you so much for that update, Tanupriya. Thank you for joining us. On March 29, the government of Saudi Arabia decided to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as a dialogue partner, making it the third Arab country after Egypt and Qatar to do so. The decision to join the SCO was taken in a cabinet meeting headed by King Salman bin Abdulaziz Al Saud, according to the state-run Saudi press agency. The matter of Saudi Arabia joining the organization was first discussed during Chinese President Xi Jinping's visit to Riyadh in December last year. The Saudis also expressed interest in joining BRICS Plus, a grouping of Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. We are now joined by Abdul from People's Dispatch, who has the latest on this issue. Welcome to this episode, Abdul. First off, what is important about Beijing and Riyadh coming together? Can you give us a little bit of context of how this came about?
Well, Saudi Arabia deciding to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization comes in a particular context, and that we should remember that this is coming after China mediated a talk between Iran and Saudi Arabia earlier this month, which led to a kind of rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which were basically considered to be a kind of regional rivals for hegemony. So that was one important development. The other, of course, is related to there is a news about Saudi Aramco signing a billions of dollars deal with some of the Chinese petrochemical companies to establish a refinery inside China. So these two news items should be kept in mind when we are talking about Saudi Arabia's decision to join Shanghai Cooperation Organization, because it basically all these three incidents coming one after the other. Of course, Xi Jinping's visit to the Gulf and Saudi Arabia in December last year also is important. All these events basically indicate that there is a growing closeness between China and Saudi Arabia in particular, and China's overall intervention or role in the larger West Asian politics, Gulf politics, is increasing. So it is important that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization will have a new Arab member. There are, of course, Egypt and Qatar part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and Saudi Arabia is a third Arab country joining it. It will also increase the overall prospect of that organization, of course, but it will basically lead to a greater closeness between Saudi Arabia and China. And given the larger geopolitical calculations, given the history of Saudi Arabia, given the US interest in the region, or if we calculate all of this, this is really a big news coming from the region.
Right, and another question would be like, what do you think are going to be geopolitical implications for the larger region of West Asia?
Of course, as I said before, since Saudi Arabia has a history of being the closest US ally in the entire Gulf region, and also in the larger Arab world, uh, uh, given the fact that the relationship between the US and Saudi Arabia has not been the same as it used to be before, um, it has widely been reported that how Saudi Arabia did not agree with the US proposal to increase the production of oil last year, despite Biden visiting personally to the country. Saudi Arabia has also basically refuted the larger US quote unquote apprehensions about rising Iranian role and Iran being a competitor of Saudi Arabia in the region. Saudi Arabia has also not, unlike UAE and Bahrain, has not signed the Abraham Accord despite US pushing for it. So given that some kind of distance which Saudi Arabia has maintained or is trying to maintain with the US in the last few months, and given its readiness, its willingness to basically participate in Chinese initiatives in the region, despite their differences with Iranians, which used to be considered very fundamental differences, it shows that there is a larger realignment happening in the region, where the traditional US allies are moving away from US, no more trusting the US policies, because in last few years US policies have done nothing but apart from causing destruction and disruptions for their larger interest, and causing various kinds of conflicts in the region. They are gradually, it seems, they are realizing it, and they are basically moving towards China, which basically is pushing for a larger multilateral world. So this realignment, which of course it has very initial stage, we do not know in what way it will turn out in the future, but at least there seems to be the larger understanding among the Arab countries that US policies are not good for the region, and they need someone like China, which basically respects the differences, does not try to impose its own values on them, and is pushing for peace and cooperation rather than conflict. And that basically is basically the larger significance, geostrategic and geopolitical significance of this particular development.
Right. Thank you so much for that update, Abdul. Thank you. FIFA has stripped Indonesia of its right to host the Under-20 Football World Cup. The global governing body of football announced its decision on Wednesday, March 29, following Indonesia's Football Federation's decision to cancel the draw for the tournament after the governor of Bali refused to host the Israeli team. Earlier this month, protesters marched in Indonesia's capital Jakarta, waving Indonesian and Palestinian flags, and demanded that Israel should not be allowed to participate. We are now joined by Siddhant Annie, who has more details on this issue. Thanks for joining us, Siddhant. First off, can you tell us why was Indonesia stripped of its rights to host this event?
Indonesia, Shreya, doesn't have official diplomatic relations with Israel. The state of Israel has qualified. Their football team has qualified for the first time for this tournament, the Under-20 Men's Football World Cup Finals. The tournament itself is one of the most important in sort of world football. It's kind of the setting stage for what happens in the future. So Israel have qualified for the first time for this event, and Indonesia are participating and have sort of they are qualified as hosts. Now, because they don't recognize Israel, and there's a massive support in Indonesia for the Palestinian cause, for the two-state solution to the situation in Palestine, there were large-scale protests across the country against allowing the Israeli team to participate. And therefore, I think FIFA has taken a call to kind of, the tournament was due to start on the 20th of May. So about just over a month and a couple of weeks for that tournament to begin. And I think getting a sense of fearing that the protests will intensify and there will not be a workable solution that all the parties involved will be able to find, all the parties being essentially the government of Indonesia, which is hosting the tournament along with its football association, and FIFA on the other side. It's a result of the pressure that has been put on FIFA particularly to sort of by the people of Indonesia that has led to this. It's being called stripping of rights, I guess, and because it would be very difficult for FIFA to come to an alternative solution in this case. Unless they were to go a step further and say that the team from Israel can participate as a neutral country, as we are seeing suggestions being made for in the Olympic disciplines for Russia and Belarus and other countries. So that is essentially why it has been kind of, and it's also an important tournament. It's not like an under-17 World Cup, which there wouldn't be any takers for. For example, Argentina, who have failed to qualify for this year's under-20 World Cup, I think at least that's some of the chatter that they would be keen to take over the hosting rights. And this issue, of course, would not be an issue of such prominence. We saw the Palestinian cause at the forefront as far as people were concerned at the recent Men's World Cup finals in Qatar as well. In that case, FIFA took a stance along with Qatar, allowing people to voice their opinions and all of that. But here, since it was a question of participation, and it would be impossible for FIFA to say, okay, Israel can't attend this tournament because of where it's being held, because Israel is a member nation of FIFA, and in that sense, it wouldn't apply. So they took this call, and I'm guessing now they've postponed the tournament. They'll push it by a few months or so to give themselves more time to prepare, to give the new host country a little more time to prepare as well.
Right, and Siddhant, you mentioned about how important this hosting this particular tournament was for Indonesia. First, because of the kind of craze that is regarding football in the country, and second, because this was the first time. What are likely to be the implications football-wise for Indonesia?
I mean, so let's take the Argentinian example to kind of give a context to that a little bit. A project that was started back in 1995 when Qatar hosted the Under-20 World Cup by Jose Pekerman, who was the coach of the Argentina Under-20s, culminated in 2022 with Argentina winning the senior men's trophy. In 2005, Lionel Messi was in the squad that won the Under-20 World Cup and has then gone on to dominate world football, along with a sort of class or a generation of players that have all had quite distinguished and quite successful professional careers. So that is the kind of impact that it can have on the long-term development of football. Like you rightly pointed out, Indonesia is a football-crazy country, as are most countries on this planet. And they're also trying to get their act together and sort of clean up house after what was the most tragic incident in the recent past in that country. There was a stampede where over 130 people died in East Java at a football game. And Indonesia back in 2016 have been suspended for government interference, much like our country, India, was also recently suspended for government interference in the operation of football. What are the repercussions theoretically? And because I guess the Football Association doesn't want to lose these hosting rights and the chance to participate, they are talking it up a little bit. The worst case scenario can be that they will once again be sanctioned, which is to say that they will not be allowed to participate in any FIFA events, their teams will not be sent, and perhaps even as far as their club sides or the league not being recognized. But since this decision has been taken by FIFA, while Indonesia was still saying that, we can work out a solution. Joko Widodo, they're going out in public and telling the people that this doesn't change our policy with regards to Israel or with regards to Palestine and our solidarity with the people of Palestine. But because we are a FIFA member nation, we have to do this. So perhaps the solution was still workable, but since FIFA took the decision, I don't think there will be much more repercussion in terms of the political side of it. Of course, the impact of it most likely will be that the team from Indonesia will not participate and will be replaced by whoever now hosts. Like Argentina, for example, since they are not part of the setup, they will say, okay, we'll take on your tournament at the last minute, but then, of course, we want to put a team in there. We're not hosting it just out of the goodness of our hearts. So the footballers will suffer, but I guess from a political point of view, if so many people in Indonesia do not want this to happen, then the result of it is that FIFA has moved out, and I guess in that sense, they are getting what they wanted. So football is, in that sense, a much smaller part of the picture.
Right. Thank you for joining us. Thank you. And that's all we have for today's episode. For more such stories, keep watching peoplesdispatch.org. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.